Maduro, or something like that. That's the big news after the January 3rd strike that took about 2 hours to extract the former president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. He is now in American custody, preparing to stand trial for a list of drug and criminal offenses, and everybody's talking about it. And I thought we should too. So I went looking for some information, and I found this guy named Alex who appears to have his thumb on the pulse of this whole thing. So we're going to do some clips from him. We're going to have a few comments from people like Bernie Sanders who are upset that a socialist dictator has been deposed. Bernie is only beginning to understand the length and breadth of just what's about to go down in Venezuela. We're going to try to take it apart at least a little bit in less than 60 seconds. Not everyone can get up every day and look for ways to piss people off. But here at GrokTALK.com, we do that almost every day. I can't tell you how many times someone's lost their SHIT and threatened to end us. But we're still here, pissing people off. It's almost like we enjoy it. And we've been doing it since 2006. That's almost 2 decades of news, politics, and opinion, and now podcasts, and we're just getting started. We believe in principles before parties and politicians. We defend free markets and individual liberty, and if that makes you mad, it makes us smile. We're like Grandma after she stopped caring what other people thought. If that sounds refreshing, you need to check us out. This is Steve McDonald for GrokTALK, and we'll keep shining the light on them for you. All right, welcome to GrokTALK, brought to you by GrokTALK.com and Grok Media LLC. Please donate to the cause. Helps us bring programming like this and helps us broadcast the voices of lots of other people, including you. So the story about Maduro being seized by the Trump administration has consumed the news cycle. And of course, why the heck not? I mean, first of all, nobody knew it was coming. And that may be one of the bigger stories in the aftermath. There were no leaks. Nobody knew a thing until it happened. And even then they were like, huh? And of course, Democrats in Congress were like, why didn't you tell us? And Rubio was like, Marco Rubio says, well, you would have told Maduro. And that's pretty much true. And the fact that that is true is why. And so again, we have to give props to the Trump administration, whether you agree with them or not, when it talks to actual actions. They have been almost entirely leak-proof, which is the exact opposite of what happened the first time around. Lessons were learned, things were tightened up. People are afraid to talk because technically, well, legally, it's against the law, and Mr. Trump and his administration are going to enforce the law. And one of the things that is part of the law is that during the Biden administration in March of 2020, his Department of Justice had a federal grand jury which indicted Mr. Maduro on a long list of charges, to which several have been added since, but he is a criminal. He is a criminal on foreign soil, and Mr. Trump and the DEA used the U.S. military to go in and get him. Democrats, not very happy about that. So there were a lot of questions. We've had drugs, Maduro, drugs. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit. We have a clip from Alex, and he does a great job of explaining it. Again, with these clips from Alex, I have 3, and most of them are about 5 minutes long. I'm just going to excerpt a little bit. I would like very much for you to go and watch them all. They are loaded with information, and they can lead you to hunt down all sorts of facts on your own to verify, and that's what we recommend you do. So anyway, first off, it was drugs. Well, we're blowing up drug boats. We're doing this. We're doing the other thing, yada, yada, yada. So what's the deal with that? Is Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela, the nation that he had taken over and turned basically into a narco drug state, really doing what Mr. Trump claimed? Here's Alex.
The cocoa leaves grown by the FARC and other groups in Colombia are moved into Venezuela, processed into cocaine in facilities protected by Venezuelan officials, and then flown to Central America, destined for U.S. markets. In 2010, the UN found that over 50% of the maritime cocaine shipments to Europe detected between 2006 and 2008 came from Venezuela. In 2015, the U.S. General John Kelly, the 4-star general and head of U.S. Southern Command at the time, said that almost all drug trafficking flights to Central America and the Caribbean originated in Venezuela. Now, there's tons of evidence on this, but we'll use the example of Walid Makled Garcia. the Venezuelan businessman and billionaire drug kingpin who was arrested in 2010. Macled claimed that he built his empire with the help of at least 40 Venezuelan generals and a Supreme Court justice and countless other officials. When he was arrested in Colombia in 2010, both the US and Venezuela requested his extradition. Chavez fought aggressively to get him back, possibly worried about what Macled might reveal to US authorities. But Macled was just a small part of the drug trafficking machine rooted in the Chavez government. In 2008, the US sanctioned 3 senior Chavez officials for FARC-related trafficking. These were the first sanctions the US ever imposed on Venezuela. They were Hugo Carvajal, Chavez's head of military intelligence, Henry Rangel Silva, his head of civilian intelligence, and Ramon Rodriguez Chacín, his interior minister. Chavez, of course, dismissed the accusations as Yankee imperialism. That's a direct quote. But it's clear that drug networks penetrated the highest levels of the Venezuelan state. Since U.S. oil sanctions hit Venezuela in 2019, the Maduro regime has relied even more heavily on drug revenues to maintain the corruption networks that keep him in power.
So as it turns out, Alex goes on to explain that for 8 years, over the course of 8 years, Venezuela exported roughly 100 tons of cocaine that were eventually meant to go into the United States over the course of 8 years. Along the way, a lot of that gets infused in some way or another with fentanyl, which we can thank China for. So while Venezuela wasn't actually using fentanyl, it did export the cocaine to which the fentanyl was added, which, of course, is part of the drug problem and the death problem and the rest of it. Alex points out that more recently, they've amped that up to 100 tons of cocaine a year, funneled from Colombia through Venezuela, where it was processed, generating billions and billions in drug dollars to the people in charge. And it's the entire government, as he pointed out. They were running a cocaine operation disguised as a country. Now, he does point out that some of the people in the drug boats that got blown up are very likely just poor fishermen who were forced by the cartels to carry this cocaine. That's kind of tragic, but that's going to stop now. And there's another really good reason why, but we're going to get to that in a couple of minutes. First, we have to talk about oil. Now, that's the other thing. I've had conversations with people offline about Guyana, which is right next to Venezuela, and they have an oil field offshore that they kind of share with Venezuela, and they wanted to develop it. But Venezuela, being Venezuela, wanted very much to do so too. Of course, the problem with Venezuela is that while it has the largest oil reserves in the entire world, Chavez and Maduro completely destroyed the operation with cronies and idiots, and the infrastructure collapsed. Here's Alex again to give you a pretty good rundown of what's been going on.
So this is the comment I keep seeing. Oil. They don't care about Maduro. They want the oil. Oil is the goal. It's all about oil. Oil, oil, oil. Okay, so let's talk about that. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on Earth. Its reserves are 13% bigger than Saudi Arabia's. But not all oil is the same. Saudi oil is light and easy to refine. Venezuelan oil is extremely heavy, thick, difficult to process, and only certain refineries in the world can handle it. Oil was discovered in Venezuela in the 1920s, and the US was immediately involved. American oil companies literally built Venezuela's oil industry because the country didn't have the infrastructure or the technology to do so. At the time, Venezuela was a poor country with an agrarian economy. It was mostly coffee and cacao plantations. There were no petroleum engineers, no heavy machinery, zero knowledge on how to run a global oil industry. But by 1928, with lots of help from US oil companies, Venezuela was one of the world's top exporters. Overnight, Venezuela became one of the richest countries in the world. In 1975, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and created PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, or Venezuelan Petroleum, the state-owned company that still exists today. But even after the nationalization of its oil industry, Venezuela still needed the US. Why? Because the US Gulf Coast has huge refineries built specifically for heavy crude, the type of oil that sits under Venezuela. And this arrangement benefited both sides. Venezuela, a country roughly the size of Texas, doesn't have anywhere near the refining infrastructure needed to process hundreds of thousands of barrels of heavy crude oil per day. Venezuela's own refineries can only handle a fraction of what the country extracts, so US refineries processed it. Venezuela got billions in revenue, and American companies profited from the refining operations. Everyone had a reason to keep the partnership going. But without heavy crude, those US refineries struggle. They literally hunger for Venezuelan oil. Now, there's this big misconception that Hugo Chavez, the populist and self-proclaimed socialist president of Venezuela, who died in 2013, took back the industry from the US private interests that controlled it. But that's simply not true. Chavez became hostile to the US politically, yes, but he still depended on the US market. Venezuelan oil continued flowing to American refineries, and Chavez took advantage of the largest oil boom in history, gaining access to billions of dollars in oil revenue. What Chavez did do was purge PDVSA, the state oil company. He fired thousands of expert workers and replaced them with loyalists. Corruption exploded, production collapsed, and the economy imploded. When Chavez died in 2013, he handpicked this man, Nicolás Maduro, as his successor. Maduro inherited a country that was collapsing economically and made it worse. Much worse. By 2017, 76 out of 84 PDVSA plants were paralyzed. Venezuela's oil production fell to 20% of its total capacity. Now, I can already hear you in the comments saying, that's because of sanctions. But no, not yet at least. Before 2019, US sanctions only targeted individual Venezuelan officials, human rights abusers, narco-traffickers, and corrupt elites. Venezuela was still completely free to sell its oil to the United States. And it did. The first oil sanctions only came in 2019, under Trump's first presidency. He basically imposed an embargo on PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company. Ironically, this hurt US companies too, because they lost access to the heavy crude their refineries are specifically built for. So why sanction PDVSA if American companies hated it? Well, because Maduro suspended elections and was consolidating a dictatorship in Venezuela. The sanctions weren't about oil, they were about politics. It was a move to support the political opposition in Venezuela, which had won an election that Nicolás Maduro refused to accept. So where does that leave us right now? 6 years later, Maduro is completely broke and running out of options. They rely on drug trafficking and illicit activities to survive. Maduro, more than Trump, funnily enough, desperately wants the US companies to reestablish their operations in Venezuela. 2 weeks ago, Maduro even offered Trump all of Venezuela's resources, including all the oil, and also to reduce economic ties with China and Russia, if Trump would just leave him alone. So if it was just about oil, Trump could have just accepted Maduro's offer, but he didn't.
So, long story short, oil doesn't really have anything to do with it. There is oil involved, and yes, oil will end up going to the U.S. like it did when Chavez and Maduro were in charge. It will get refined in U.S. refineries because there's really nowhere else to do it, and it will end up on the world market, hopefully suppressing the price so that inflation stays lower and we can all have better lives. In the meantime, the regime is changing in Venezuela. My first thought was, okay, so you got rid of Maduro. What about all those other assholes who are all making obscene amounts of money thanks to the narco-terror state of which they were a part? Alex had some thoughts on that. I haven't heard anybody else say it. Here he is.
When the US struck Venezuela on January 3rd to capture Nicolás Maduro, they destroyed essentially all of Venezuela's aerial defense systems. Every major airport and major military bases were hit. Venezuela does not have the capacity to fight back anymore. They're sitting ducks. The US can ride in on a helicopter or a plane and do whatever they want. They can strike any member of the regime wherever they are, whenever they want. And they know that Trump is willing to do it now. And that's the difference between the before and after of January 3rd. The people who are left within the regime, people like Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, they know they're surrounded by military and political power far superior to anything they control at this moment. They have no room to negotiate. Their hands are tied. At this point, their only option is to cooperate or be eliminated.
So these are all interesting turns of events, and we can't forget that Venezuela had a very close relationship with China, Russia, and Iran. That one is really important. And I don't have time to go into it in detail, and I certainly want to dig into it some more, but Iran has a really tight relationship with Venezuela. They are a lot closer than anybody realizes, I think. China and Russia, of course, not very happy about this. Russia actually denounced it. So there's a lot of advantages strategically, militarily, economically for going in and having a very precise extraction. 2 hours, nobody knew, no American equipment lost, no American lives lost. So that leaves us with all these other assholes. Well, Alex just explained what's likely going to happen. Yes, there probably will be some issues with guerrillas. I can't see why there wouldn't be. But if the U.S. completely controls the airspace and there's a massive fleet of ships right off the coast, if you want to stay alive, it becomes very important that you do it somewhere else. So who ends up running Venezuela? Well, they just elected a president who wasn't Maduro. That's probably their best choice. Trump says that they're going to just handle some of the top-level administrative stuff while they work with Venezuelans, who are very, very excited about Maduro being gone, because most of them aren't on the take. They're the ones that end up as political prisoners, getting tortured by generals and their lackeys. So the military, I don't know if they really care one way or the other who pays them, as long as they get paid. So we'll see how that all shakes out. There's a lot going on. In the midst of it, we have our own assholes right here in America. One of them by the name of Bernie Sanders, who released a press release on January 3rd. Donald Trump has once again shown his contempt for the Constitution and the rule of law. The President of the United States does not have the right to unilaterally take this country to war, even against a corrupt and brutal dictator like Maduro. The United States does not have the right, as Trump stated this morning, to run Venezuela. Congress must immediately pass war powers resolutions to end this illegal military operation and reassert its constitutional responsibilities. Blah, 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 blah. Trump campaigned for president on an America First platform. He claimed to be the peace candidate. At a time when 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, when our healthcare system is collapsing, when people cannot afford housing, and when AI threatens millions of jobs, it is time for the president to focus on the crisis facing this country and end this military adventurism abroad. Trump is failing in his job to run the United States. He should not be trying to run Venezuela. I mean, there's plenty in there that we could talk about. Bernie doesn't give a shit about military intervention overseas. I'm not going to go through it all, but let's find all the examples since Bernie's been in the Senate where he was like, or even Congress, because he's been up there forever. Bernie doesn't give a damn. He cares about politics and vectors for power. And he loves Chavez. He loves Maduro. You know how many Cubans are in that government? He loves the Cuban communist government. So this is just him being pissed off. As far as whether or not it's starting a war, there's no war. We had one incident, and it was to extract Maduro. There hasn't been any fighting since then. There are no troops on the ground. We've just basically removed the illegitimate dictator who Mr. I'm for Democracy Sanders should know isn't the rightful president. The one they elected, the one Maduro refused to allow to win and take the job, Venezuelans elected somebody else. They wanted a different government. And now what we've got is an opening. And hopefully within 60 to 90 days, they'll have some elections and we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, Democrats have lost their minds. They're defending this idiot. I mean, you just saw the clips. If all of that stuff's as true as he says, this is probably a really good thing for everybody, especially Venezuela. Thanks for your time and attention. GrokTALK will be back next week. Morning update, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Check it out.
GrokTALK.